All right. Welcome to the special Tom's Hardware Show. Special because we normally do this on Thursday. And today I'm joined by three of my co-editors, managers, whatever their positions are. And the big news, of course, is Nvidia's Ada Lovelace RTX 4090, RTX 4080. We'll go ahead and roll the intro and then get talking. So, we've been waiting for a new architecture for 2 years, almost exactly, from Nvidia, and right on schedule, kind of. We got Ada. I say kind of because I think they could have pushed this out earlier this year had it not been for cryptocurrency and inventory overload and all of those other things that were piling on top of it, supply chain issues. But it's now announced, and we have a hard launch date for the 4090 of October 12th. With a price of $15.99. How's that sit with you, Matt?
I mean, I still have to pay rent, so I'm gonna wait for something that's more affordable. But yeah, I mean, it's been interesting.
Rent or graphics card.
Yes, I mean, just watching. I mean, this was already the case before, right? But we've watched over the last 10 years or so. You know, I remember when $300 was a lot for a graphics card, right? So yeah, it's been interesting, but at the same time, it's good to see something new because we've had the same. Seems
like you could just live in the Omniverse instead of your apartment.
Just stop it. I'm so tired of hearing about Omniverse. I'm sure for the people who use NVIDIA's Omniverse, it can do some really cool stuff. I play games and I test graphics cards on the local PC only, basically. And I'm like, yeah, Omniverse. They did show some cool stuff that we can talk a little bit about one of the things they showed in here. But yeah. Andrew, Mr. Laptops.
Well, first of all, I was just going to say, about the 4090, part of me was a little surprised about how they framed it, because when they did the 3090 Ti, they were very much this is for, this is for, not for gamers. This is a Titan replacement. They didn't really say that this time. They called everything they announced enthusiast grade, but they didn't necessarily, say, oh, it's not for gaming. So,
well,
to see how that goes.
When one market goes away, they have to replace it.
Yeah, I think they're freaking out a little bit about that crypto crash.
But so, Jared, you were
definitely for gamers. Every gamer, go buy a graphics card.
Yeah.
But Jared, you were saying laptops, right? I mean, they didn't announce laptop cards today. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe CES at the earliest. So maybe January.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the three cards they announced today, all three of them basically look like stuff that I'm not sure you can scale even an AD104 chip down to fit in a laptop power envelope. Maybe you can, but certainly not the top two chips, the AD102, AD103. Those seem like big power hungry things that will never go in a laptop. So
yeah,
I'm curious to see what they do.
In a laptop, the laptop might hover from the fans.
Yeah. They haven't to date done a 90 in a laptop, so I'm not expecting to see a 4090 just because they never did a 3090 before that. But if you told me that the 4080 will be based on AD104 and not 103, that wouldn't shock me, but we have time to see. I imagine it'll top out at an 80. And then
you'll get laptop parts when I get desktop 4070 and 4060, and they'll call the desktop or the laptop 4080 will basically be a 4070 or 4060 is my bet.
That's often how it goes.
All right, and for all those who are grumbling about the $15.99 price tag, will there be pre-orders? Casey Holt wants to know, and this is the thing. And I'm not throwing shade on Casey here, because there are a lot of people out there, thousands certainly, that are ready to upgrade to the highest end GPU possible. And based on what Nvidia is showing with Ada and the RTX 4090, this is not this small 20-30% boost in performance. This looks like it will be pretty substantial. And I can pretty much guarantee the 4090 and 4080 cards will sell out at launch. how long will they stay sold out? That's the real question, and that I don't have an answer to, because it depends on how many they had manufactured and a lot of other factors, but clearly they want to get rid of their 30 series cards because all of these are priced high enough that they can continue to sell a 3090 Ti at $900, $800, and it probably costs less for Nvidia to make than that. So Nvidia can still make money and clear
Probably.
inventory. Their partners are a different matter. EVGA is like it's thrown in the towel. It's saying, nope, I'm not going to play this game anymore, Nvidia. So, yeah.
Part of me wonders how many they were able to make in the first place, and with just in the fact that they highlighted so heavily that they're keeping the 30 series around. That like maybe they weren't able to make that many on TSMC's 4N node. That like maybe they couldn't make as many as they wanted.
I mean, like, chip size does dictate how many, chips you get per wafer. I think I've done the math before, and the size is basically the same as GA102. They're both around 628, 629 millimeters squared. And that means I think it was around 100 chips per wafer. And how many wafers did they order? That's what we don't know for sure, but tens of thousands is my guess. Some of them will go to Hopper. Some of them will go to Ada. They could push more 8102 chips instead of 8103, 8104 because they want to clear out the 30 series inventory. So they start at the high end and maybe they stay there longer. But how long can they stay there when AMD is talking about RDNA 3? That's going to be a thorn in Nvidia's side, I think. Let's see. We got some comments here. Nvidia's solution to high temps and ever-increasing list for computational power is to increase size, weight, and add more transistors. I don't know that I'd say no real innovation, but they are pushing the limits. I mean, I think it's 450 watts, they said, for the power limit, and that's not insanely high, honestly. Like, it could have been a lot worse. I don't have my specs slide available because I wanted to do that. All right, this is the beauty of Ada Lovelace. This is the big chip, 76 billion transistors. Of note, the previous generation made on Samsung's 8N process had, I think, 28.6 billion transistors. Like, this is almost triple the transistor count. That is not a small change. Like, and you can see there are basically 12 GPC clusters. We'll go to the next slide that shows other specs for those who want to see it. 12 GPC clusters, each with 12 streaming multiprocessors, so a maximum of 144 SMs, and each of the SMs still has 128 CUDA cores, if you want to call them CUDA cores, CUDA pipelines, CUDA shaders, whatever. So a maximum of, what is that, 144 times 128? It's a big number. 18,432 is the maximum CUDA core count, but the RTX 4090 disables, it looks like, 16 of the streaming multiprocessors. So that improves yields a lot. Like 16 out of 144, 10% of the chip roughly, a little bit more. Not whole chip, 10% of the SMs at least. So, it's a big chip. Architectural enhancements too. Like, it's not just Ampere made on 4N instead of 8N. It's Ampere plus architectural enhancements plus clock speed improvements made on TSMC's process. So, these are big changes. Let me see if there were other questions. I don't think there's any I need to answer right now. So, let's go through the quick overview. The shaders. New streaming multiprocessor, 2x the power efficiency, up to 90 teraflops of FP32 performance. I don't think that 90 is actually for the RTX 4090 though. That's like a future GPU maybe. I think they said 83 teraflops on the 4090 because they disabled some of the chip. Ray tracing, actually go back to shaders for a second. They also had a new feature called RES. SER, shader execution reordering, something like that. I think I've got a slide on that next. No, we got 4090 slides next. All right, third generation RT cores, double the ray triangle throughput, basically more than double the RT teraflops if you want to use Nvidia's made up performance metric. I really wish there were a better standardized way of discussing ray tracing performance, like outside of just running benchmarks, but we'll do that soon enough. And then deep learning. This is interesting here because they say 4th generation tensor cores up to 1.4 petaflops of tensor performance. That's no longer FP16 tensor cores. Those are FP8 calculations, which is double the throughput of your FP16. And so really, the tensor cores, they added FP8 support, but they didn't improve the number of FP16 calculations you could do per core. So I think Hopper has they do a big tensor chunk that can do up to 1024 FP16 operations per tensor core. The Ada is 1/4 of that pretty much. So, and I'm not saying that we needed more tensor core performance, but it is an interesting divergence. Anyone want to say anything about this before I click through some other slides?
Not really. I mean, it makes
A lot of specs.
it makes sense for them to differentiate from Hopper, right? Like they need to have differences between these cards, otherwise they run into problems that they've had in the past where people are just buying gaming cards for things that aren't gaming, right?
Yeah.
So,
Actually, I got one for you, Jared. There's one piece of hardware on here that they were talking about that is required for DLSS 3, right? And I think that's. Do you remember which piece of hardware that was?
You know, I needed to look a little more into that. I thought DLSS 3 would work on the other cards, but maybe I missed that. So it was like a fire hose of information for
it really
an
was.
hour and a half.
Because that to me is an important thing we got to figure out. If it's only on these, it's an interesting thing. If the software, if it kept getting better, they could make it so you never need a new card. But
yeah,
I believe it's the optical flow accelerator.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was a software component in DLSS 3. We'll get to that more later. But if it's a software component, that's different. But if
it's powered by the. Sorry, I found the quote now. DLSS 3 is powered by the new 4th gen tensor cores and optical flow accelerator on GeForce RTX 40 series GPUs. So those new tensor cores are making DLSS 3. That's specifically for the RTX 40 series. They're locking it out of the 30 and 20 series.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's not too shocking because, maybe they needed more compute performance. And when you think about it, the range of compute that are offered by the RTX cards currently, it's pretty huge. I mean, the 3090 Ti, and we're talking about tensor core compute, not the FP32 compute. So the 3090 Ti can do up to 625 teraflops of FP16 throughput, right? And it's okay, well, using that, they need to figure out how to intelligently upscale a frame and make it look better. So you turn a 1080p frame into, 4K. Great. But then down at the other end of the spectrum, you've got cards like the RTX 2060 and the RTX 3050, and those have tensor throughput of the 3050 is up to 73 teraflops, I believe, and the 2060 is 52 teraflops. So basically less than a tenth of the performance of the big Mamba Jamba 3090 Ti. And now we're going, hey, we've got the newcomer 4090 that can do up to 1.4 petaflops of FP8 calculations or 700 teraflops of FP16. So, yeah. Is there a way to put user in timeout? Yes. Sorry, there was someone spamming the comments. All right, let's go on. 4090. This is going to be fast because hey, what does it look like to you guys? It looks exactly like a 3090 Ti to me, right?
Hey, it's got the new font.
Yes.
Can we
RTX
talk about that
bold.
kerning?
That's
20 minutes on the kerning.
What they spent all their crypto billions on was a new font, right?
Yeah.
I guess they were like, why fix what ain't broke?
They
And then crypto
bolded
crashed.
RTX, right? That's basically the changes. They bolded RTX or they unbolded the numbers.
They unbolded the numbers. They got the bigger fan too.
Yeah, I'll actually have to see it side by side with the 3090 Founders Edition because, yeah, it does look bigger for sure. So, I mean,
I'm sure it is.
Is
and
that
just
going to be
what thing we've seen from the third-party card photos so far too?
Yeah.
They're definitely going to be bigger, beefier, cooler.
Yeah,
sure.
the third-party cards.
I had to look over, and my case has a 3090 in it right now, so I was looking at it. It's a big fan on the 3090 too, though. It's just probably like a little bit smaller. I think this fan actually is a bigger change, if I remember right. I think this fan on the 3090 was smaller than the other fan, so maybe that changed. Still a triple slot GPU.
Yeah, it's a beefy card.
Yeah.
So thick, yeah.
I mean, every time I pick up the 3090 card, I'm like, wow, this is heavy. It's like 2.2 kilograms. And I'm not saying I'm like, oh, that's too heavy, I'm weak. But it's like, I pick it up and I mean, my test bed back in the corner behind me, this thing here. I've got, which way am I supposed to point? I've got a GPU stand that came with an MSI Supreme X card that I leave in there, and it's every time I put in like a 3090 or 3080 Ti or even some of the 3080 12 gigabyte card, they're all so heavy that I'm like, yeah, I don't just want that like sagging and hanging on the PCIe slot. So I like my kickstand. Yeah. Oh, and of course there's now just that's not really any different. We went from a 12-pin connector to a 12 plus 4-pin connector. The extra 4 pins are just for, I believe, communication of needs. We'll just leave it at that. All right, here's the big overview of the family. This is where I think people are getting a little more upset because there's no TI cards yet, and we've got a 4080 sitting at $1,200 and $900. So that's $200 more than the 3080. Same price as the 3080 Ti. I mean, the 4090 at $1,600. That's only $100 more than the 3090 launch price, and I'm actually happy it's $400 less than the 3090 Ti. I didn't think $2,000 was a sustainable price for the extreme uber rich gamers, content creators, and whatever. Like $1,600 isn't terrible. It's not affordable, but it could have been worse, right? So I'm not too sad about that. But then,
I mean, if the market was still where it was 6-8 months ago, it would have been worse.
It would have been worse, yes. And I think that's probably what EVGA was looking at, because they probably went, hey, you're looking at $900, $1,200, and $1,600. We've got a flood of 30 series cards that we still need to sell. We're selling them at a loss now. They're basically losing $100, $200 on every 3090 Ti sold, I think they were implying. I don't know if that's the true financials or if there's some other things going on, but it's, there's a big gap between the 3080 and the 4080 in performance as well. So that's going to be interesting, like how far down 3080 prices will fall, because they could definitely go lower. But it feels like the 3080 10 gigabyte.
So I should not buy a graphics card
Yeah,
yet.
you should wait. You should wait.
You keep telling me that, though. This rate, never going to get one.
Soon, Sarah, soon.
Things keep falling. Crypto crashes even more somehow.
Yeah, I just looked at cryptocurrency mining profitability, which, gives me a little smile now instead of a pain, where, like, basically if you look at NiceHash and their approximate income per day, if your electricity costs 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which is about what I pay, it's less than a lot of people pay, more than a few people pay. Like, basically nothing is profitable right now. And I feel like NiceHash's estimates are probably generous because they don't include your CPU or your motherboard or power supply inefficiencies. So, they're saying, oh, you can make 1 cent per day off of a 2080 Ti, and I'm like going, yeah, probably you're going to end up losing 10 cents per day. So that's good to see, because it means miners shouldn't be picking these up. I mean, even if your power were free, you could make theoretically 35 cents a day on a high-end card. So if these doubled the performance, maybe that's a little more something they might look at. But gosh, I hope no coins take off again that are GPU mineable.
Now, Jared, I'm curious about one thing. Is I've been looking at a lot of the reactions to the pricing, and a lot of people they're mad. They're like, oh, like the pandemic shortage pricing is here to stay, it's never going away. But the other thing I saw is a lot of people looking at it saying the 4090 is the best deal.
Yeah.
Relative to other prices. Do you agree there?
We'll have to see how they actually perform, and I think you're really going to need a 4K monitor if you want any of these 3 cards that were announced today. The 4080 12GB, 4080 16GB, and 4090. Because even like the 3090 Ti is basically overkill for 1440p for the most part. I guess if you're playing with ray tracing, but I'm like, you can turn on DLSS and ray tracing and still get, decent 1440p usage upscaled to 4K. So, I mean, I don't know, like, here's the thing. TSMC's 4N process is probably double the cost of Samsung 8N, meaning to Nvidia. And if you double the price of just the GPU, like, that's not going to be, it's not going to result in a card that costs the same. What's more is we've had inflation all over the place. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I fill up with gas or go grocery shopping. Everything's gone up in price. And I'm like, well, $200 extra on a 4080 versus a 3080 actually isn't that bad compared to how much some things have gone up. So I'm not saying I like the inflation, but
you're saying I should buy a graphics card and not groceries.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's the new diet. If
checking.
you're like me and need to drop some pounds, just buy a graphics card.
You can't game on a loaf of bread, Sarah.
I know. What am I thinking? I don't need
You could play
$200
some
worth of
games.
groceries.
Not computer games, but there's a lot of messages going by, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think the pricing could have been really lower realistically, because as I've said, there's this glut of 30 series cards out there. I mean, reportedly there are warehouses full now of 30 series cards that need to be sold, and Nvidia doesn't want to lose money on those. They don't want to kill their partners' profits as well. Like, everyone made a lot of money last year. We know that, so they could stomach it. But at the same time,
but they don't want to.
They probably spent a lot of that money too, looking forward. They
hoping.
went, let's order extra RTX 30 series GPUs before they're sold out again, and then all of a sudden no one wants to buy them, and you end up with a bunch of cards that you need to sell. I mean, that kind of feels like what happened to EVJ on some level, because they're currently the cheapest RTX 30 series cards you can find. So it is what it is. I think if you want like a more affordable card, those will come probably somewhere between January and March of next year. We'll see a 4070 for like $600, $700. We'll see a 4060 eventually. That'll probably be like next summer. Every generation, their price looks like it's going up, or every series. So like the 80 series is going up $100 to $200. 90 series went up $100. I think we'll see a $100 increase on a lot of the parts. Maybe we'll get an RTX 4040. I don't know. All right.
I mean, a lot of it depends, I think, as you said, like how many 30 series cards are like waiting to be sold. And, I mean, if the 30 series drop low enough and there are millions of them and people buy them, they're not going to buy a 40 series.
Yeah.
Like, especially if the price goes up. Right.
And I commented, I was talking about this with Gordon Ma-Ung from PC World and Paul last week when EVJ's things came out. And I said, look, the thing is Ethereum's network, before it switched to proof of stake, had 900 terahash per second of hashing performance. That is the equivalent of 10 million RTX 3080 cards. And, there's a mix. So there's 20 series cards, there's GTX 16 series, there's probably even RX 500 series and Vega cards, all thrown in with the newer stuff as well. There are probably 20 million GPUs or more, maybe even 30 million, depending on the generational mix, that were all just being used purely for Ethereum mining for the past 2 years. And that's gone. They can't do Ethereum, and nothing else is profitable right now. So if you own any of those cards as a miner, you're like, well, I better sell them. That's my thought process. And so not only do you have the cards in the channel, but you have potentially 10 to 20 million mining GPUs that are going to be offloaded however they can for whatever money they can still get out of them. And that's going to hurt pricing potential as well.
Yep.
As Licorice puts it, GPU miners shaking in your boots. We hope so. All right.
So before you go forward, can you go backwards to the pictures of like the different angles? You know what I'm noticing? The 40 series appears to mean that SLI is dead again.
Oh, yes.
I'm not seeing the connectors.
There's no SLI connector at all. No NVLink. Unless this is a rendering where they just left it off.
No,
but,
I
doubt
pulled it up. I pulled it up. I looked it on the website. It says no specifically for both 4080s and the 4090. NVLink dead again.
I don't think that's a bad decision either. I mean, I always felt like two-way SLI was kind of a crapshoot back, 10 years ago. And then it became worse, and three-way and four-way rarely scaled outside of like 3D Mark and a few popular gaming benchmarks. They were expensive. They added microstutter. They added latency, like all these bad things. Now NVIDIA is emphasizing latency with this NVIDIA Reflex stuff, and they're like, hey, let's get down to 10 milliseconds. I'm like, yeah, what was the latency on a four-way SLI setup back in the day?
Well, I mean, there's also a level of scaling of ridiculousness. Like back when that was more popular, like the cards were like maybe $500, and now they're $1,500. So, who's
going to buy like
one,
2 or 3 $1,500 cards?
I would rather have one fast $1,500 cards than two fast $800 cards, right? Like that was what I hated about SLI. You never got perfect scaling. All right, we're gonna architectural stuff. Shader execution reordering. NVIDIA said this was a big deal. They made some animations. The idea is basically your SMs, your compute cores as they are. They do best if they're all running the same sort of instruction mix on the same sort of data. And so some shaders might take 20 cycles to execute, some might take 2, some might take 5, something like that. And so the idea is this SER reorders them and tries to put the shaders together or into the same SMs so that all of the calculations are finishing in lockstep and it gets better utilization. You see fewer empty slots and boost performance. The funny thing though is that then they said this can double ray tracing performance. I'm like, oh, well, like they always throw in these ray tracing things and it's like more ray tracing, more ray tracing, more ray tracing. I still haven't seen any games that like really demand that I turn on ray tracing. It's a nice extra sometimes, but
I mean, just when they update old games, which they did
Control,
too, right?
Yeah. Like Control looks fine. Cyberpunk looks fine with ray tracing. It doesn't look worse, I don't think. But
just like Control came out in 2019, and it's still the game I go to.
Yeah.
As the best example.
So I don't know how much shader execution reordering affects non-ray tracing workloads. I assume it does help. It's not going to be purely ray tracing because when you're mixing and matching different shaders on the same SM, it seemed like that would be less efficient. So hopefully that proves to be beneficial elsewhere. This is their full stack of RTX related inventions, as they call them. So you had DLSS 1, DXR, VK rays, just Vulkan ray tracing. So like, I don't know if you'd call those inventions per se, but okay, fine. We got those things. DLSS 1 was kind of weak sauce. Like it felt like FSR 1. It worked for what you needed maybe sometimes, but not always. DLSS 2 was a big improvement, but then Reflex is not actually RTX specific. It's just something they created. RTX GI, these are just libraries for doing ray tracing, caustics. Like those are just, they made things available for graphics artists to use. Real-time denoisers, I believe that, I don't know if they use those in games so much as in like, what do you call it, professional ray tracing apps. Then we come over to 3rd gen, DLSS 3. I mean, the interesting thing was the 2nd gen stuff all ran on the 1st gen stuff, but the 3rd gen stuff looks to be actually stuff that will require 3rd gen 40 series cards or later. So real-time rate path tracing, that's not really new unless they lied about Minecraft being path tracing. I don't know. Opacity, micro maps, they talked about a little bit. It's something to accelerate ray tracing when there's transparent textures, which is kind of one of those edge cases that can cause performance to suffer a lot. Displaced micromeshes, that sounded kind of cool. The idea being you reduce the complexity of your bounding volume hierarchy, your geometry structures that the ray tracing has to zip through. You reduce the complexity there, and then these displaced micromeshes can add in geometry after the fact. So they go, oh, we figure out what it intersected, now we add triangles or something. So that sounds like a good boost to ray tracing performance. 2D SGM optical flow, that's the thing that's related to DLSS 3 as far as I can tell. They did talk about the optical flow hardware there. So, and then shader execution and reordering. So lots of things coming down the pipeline. How will those affect games in the near term? I don't think it's going to be huge, but it will help in some. This is the big one, I think, when you look at generational performance per watt, efficiency, like potential compute performance. You know, Turing to Ampere was a sizable jump, and then Ampere to Ada is a much bigger jump. So we're going from 40 teraflops to 90 teraflops potentially on shaders. That's huge. Doubling your RT performance, more than doubling your RT performance. I don't know what OFA is. Anyway, and tensor flops, they got FP8. So we talked about DLSS earlier. Here's the rundown. So this is DLSS 2. You got your frame buffers, your motion vectors. It's supposed to show depth buffers as well, and along with the 1080p input, there's the previous frame input, and they upscale that with their AI thing. Now we go to, hey, we take motion vectors and the other stuff, and now we add this optical flow accelerator and optical flow field, optical multi-frame generation. And you can see they said, hey, we went from 62 frames per second with DLSS 2, and we're going to get 101 frames per second now. That's a big jump. It sounds to me, I don't know that they've gone in detail to this. I need to watch the Digital Foundry video because they got briefed on it apparently, and we didn't. They had early access so that they could do some testing. But it sounds to me like this is sort of like, who remembers VR when they talked about, oh, what do they call it? The warp scheduling or something? Not warp scheduling. There was just in time warp something. There's a name for it. Throw it in chat if you remember it. And the idea was if you were doing VR on a headset that's running at 90 hertz, you really need to have new frames every screen update or it can make people nauseous. And so they did this just-in-time warping of the previous frame if they didn't get a new frame to interpolate between where it was, one frame ago and where it would be now. And then the next frame could be, you'd skip ahead to that, whatever. It was something cool that John Carmack of id Software worked on. He then went over to work with Oculus on related technologies. It sounds like DLSS 3's optical flow accelerator and all this stuff is actually basically able to generate 2 frames out of 1 frame, and potentially double your performance, but then do some other work. And so it's like, well, we went from 62 to 101. That's like a 67% increase or something like that. it's a 63% increase. I'm like, well, if it were doing 2 frames for every 1 frame, it would be a doubling, but there's extra work involved, so then that drops down the doubling a bit. That to me sounds like what they're doing is somehow doing 2 frames out of 1 frame with DLSS 3. In motion, I suspect that will probably work out just fine. A lot of these things do. If you're sitting there staring at it and taking screenshots or whatever, maybe it doesn't look as good, or maybe you can spot the differences easier, but it's certainly interesting. I wondered what they would do with DLSS 3 because there have been rumors about it for 6 months, and now we know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of the things that I always think about when I see this like deep analysis of these things, right? It's like from the consumer standpoint, the point is to make a game more immersive and better, right? So like, if you're playing, it's the same as anything like 3D and movies, right? Like, if the movie's good, you're not paying attention to 3D. So yeah, I mean, I think it's like you can do like a very focused look at the differences, but there's also a difference between what you can notice when you're pausing frame by frame and what you actually notice when you're playing a game that you're actually enjoying, right? So, I mean, I think if the game is good, it's immersive, a lot of that stuff is going to get lost. But.
Yeah, I will have to wait and see how it looks in practice. I mean, it's an interesting thing because it's hard to, what do you say, like objectively compare DLSS and FSR, FSR2, and now XESS, and now we'll have DLSS 3 as well. Like, these are lots of things to try and keep straight. But yeah, it's like, well, it'll be interesting to see how it actually plays out, but ultimately, you know, it is what it is. All right, I'm actually, I want to create an image here so I can share it because I forgot to include it in my slides. Go away that and give me a second. Where's my picture? No. I got my specs table.
X table.
Yes. So
when should I buy a GPU? If not now or before or in the future?
How much do you want to spend?
I don't know. About like a rent's worth, I guess.
A rent's worth?
Keep in mind she lives in LA, so that's a lot.
That's true.
Yes.
That's a
Yes.
big GPU. I think you should wait for the 4090 and buy the 4090. Sure.
Okay.
I think you
You're
should wait
saying
for
that.
I think you should wait for third-party reviews of the 40 series cards to ensure you're making the best purchase.
I'll probably do that.
I think you should wait until after CES and see what has been talked about.
Maybe if I just wait, then like 30 series cards will be free.
Yeah, I mean, look,
Because they'll just have so many of them.
I mean,
like,
eventually.
Maybe if you buy a new monitor, they'll throw in a 30 series card for free
exactly.
from Newegg Shuffle.
Like, this is also a tough thing. Like, if you don't buy the 40 series card, are we going to have the same problem? Are people going to scalp them again? Because people are still scalping everything else out there, and not just because of, mining, but because people like to be able to make money on the secondary market, whether it's like concert tickets or PlayStation 5s or whatever. So I'm curious if the 4090 and the 4080s will go the
But
same
everyone's
way.
not stuck at home. There's no mining. So there's less
I would hope.
incentive to try to scalp a like
Because otherwise,
$1,600 card.
Otherwise, I would say wait till. I mean, AMD announced today they'll be launching. Though that's a
Yeah.
a questionable
What was
term,
that?
but they're going to be launching on November 3rd their RDNA 3 cards, presumably Radeon 7000 series, and we'll see what kind of power they offer. We'll see what they offer as price, but that you might take that into consideration. Though personally, I've seen a lot of gamers wait for a long time to see AMD be their like savior on a significant price cut, and it has never happened.
They're still waiting, sadly. All right, so there was some questions earlier, like what do we think of the 4080 cards? And I mean, I'm not happy about them both being called 4080. I don't know why we can't just call the 16 gigabyte card the 4080 Ti, so that it was clear. But I guess if they always say 4080 16 gigabytes and 4080 12 gigabytes, that's good enough.
It's like
That's
the
one way of doing
3060
it.
when they did it with 6 gigabytes and 3 gigabytes, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, the 1060 had
Or the
the 3 and
1060.
6.
Yeah, not the
Yeah.
3060, the 1060. You're right.
So, oh, I didn't
But
fill in the L2 cache
are you
sizes, sorry.
are you more mad about it because of the differences in RAM, or are you more mad about it because of the presumed differences in architecture?
I mean, all of the above. I'm like, these are not the same chip. This is like when you call a laptop 4080 a 4080, and it's like, well, wait, that 4080 is actually the same chip that's used in the 3070 laptop is the same chip that's used in a 3060 desktop. And the 3080 laptop is the same chip used in a 3070 desktop. And it's like, well, that's kind of, I remember back when Nvidia did the 900 series way back in 2014, and they're like, we're going to launch laptop and desktop at the same time. That was back when I guess power efficiency was a thing they worried about, and no longer, because now we're like potentially 450 watt, 340 watt, 285 watt. I mean, I don't know if those power figures are correct, actually. I don't think Nvidia has posted those yet, or if they did, I didn't get time to look at them. But when you look at the throughput, the 16 gigabyte card is 20% faster, roughly, than the 12 gigabyte card. And then it has 25%, or is it? No, it has 33% more memory, more than 33% more memory bandwidth, because the word is it actually has 23 gigabit per second memory instead of 21 gigabit per second. I'm like, that was the reverse of what I expected. I thought the lower memory card would get faster memory to make up for the deficit in memory bandwidth that it would have. So that was kind of weird. Anyway, I don't think it's the end of the world, but I feel like it is Nvidia playing naming games, and they already had the TI name. Why didn't they just use that again? Anyway, anyone else have serious
I mean, there has to be
Feelings about that?
I think time will tell, but there has to be a reason.
I really feel the
right?
4080 12 gigabyte, that's the 4070. And it's not being launched because they can't launch a 4070 at $600 that competes with the 3090 Ti at $1,000, because then no one buys the 3090 Ti. So I do feel like if you want to be upset about something, it feels like it's just shenanigans to try and hide the fact that, hey, we're delaying launches as long as we can in order to sell out or try to sell as many of our 30 series cards as we can. And how long they can delay, I think it will depend partly on how fast AMD can ramp up production, really.
Yep, for sure.
So if you're mad at Nvidia, go buy an AMD card when they come out. That's my advice. That's
And drop ship
AMD
Intel one
supports
from
that.
China.
All right, back to this DLSS 3, already coming to 35 games. Well, not 35 games, because 2 of those are engines, but 3 of them are engines. I don't know how many.
Frostbite, Unity, Unreal.
Yeah, yep. So, and then they did performance comparisons. Are those next? I don't want to jump ahead here. No, this is next. This was kind of interesting because this was part of the GTC presentation, RTX Remix, and I was like, well, wait, they showed they were remixing Elder Scrolls.
Morrowind.
Was it Morrowind?
Yeah, it was.
Morrowind.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so they're like, yeah, so people were able to play through it, whatever, and you got the Morrowind experience with ray tracing and higher up-res textures, all this stuff, and it was interesting. But I'm like, well, are people actually going to do this? Like, I as a gamer can't do this with my own classics, right? I can't just go, hey, let me plug in, I don't know, what's a game that I used to play a lot? Not
Zelda.
Pac-Man. I mean, just like some popular game, the original Borderlands.
Lemmings.
Can I plug in Borderlands and turn it into ray traced Borderlands? I don't think that's the case.
That's kind of suggesting that you could at least sort of upscale some of the textures either through AI texture tools, just by like running it through their AI and using your own GPU, which is really interesting.
If they could make this happen where like you could actually do it as a non-programmer, non-developer, all those things, and just a gamer, and actually turn on ray tracing and DLSS and up-res textures and all that stuff, that would be really freaking cool. I don't think that's what they were talking
original
about.
Myst.
It sounds more like it's something that developers can use this to create a port of their game that will have a much higher quality. So maybe the next remastered sequence of games will all have actual like changes and effects that will look more impressive than in the past.
I mean, it sort of sounded like you could make your, like they're kind of saying like making your own mods with it.
If you subscribe to
That would be
Omniverse,
cool.
I don't know what's an Omniverse subscription cost. All right, performance. We talked about performance since earlier. This is what Nvidia showed. So Resident Evil, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Division 2, Warhammer 40k, Dark Tide, and Microsoft Flight Simulator. Important thing to note is all of those are non-ray tracing games, right? But then you look at them and you're like, okay, the 4080 12 gigabyte is a bit slower than the 3090 Ti in Resident Evil and Assassin's Creed. It's tied in Division 2, and then it gets a big boost in Warhammer 40k, Dark Tide, and Microsoft Flight Simulator. But those last two, well, I think all of these have DLSS. I think it might be DLSS 3. I don't know. Actually, no, Resident Evil probably doesn't have DLSS. That was an AMD game. Anyway, so it's hard to tell like what exactly they're saying. Are these running DLSS? Are they, comparing the same versions of the game? Microsoft Flight Simulator at present, last I checked anyway, does not have DLSS support, but it's coming soon, or something like that. So it's kind of a weird comparison. I'm like, well, what are they comparing? Because I can tell you that Microsoft Flight Simulator on a 3090 Ti running at 1080p Ultra gets about 83 frames per second on my 12900K. And at 1440p Ultra, it also gets about 83 frames per second. And at 4K Ultra, it drops down to like 70-something frames per second, I think. But basically, it's CPU limited. And so I'm like, they showed performance figures where they were like, oh yeah, we're getting like 100 and something frames per second instead of 70.
How accurate would you say Nvidia's performance?
Well, that's
I
why
was
charts usually are.
Well, I mean, when I watched this live, these numbers, I was super skeptical. So
yeah.
we'll see.
Well,
But
even now,
I'm always skeptical when any company spits out their own numbers. But this seems more weird than you.
But I mean, we've seen Nvidia, give out their own numbers in the past. So are they usually like?
Here, I'm going to read the fine print because the fine print was important. That they're running it at 4K on the highest game settings with DLSS performance mode when applicable. So if there's any question about DLSS, there it is. It says it on the slide right there at the little bottom.
Well, and it says more important. It says it says DLSS frame generation on RTX 40 series when applicable. I'm like, well, that's where
what does that mean about the 3090 Ti?
Exactly.
Right?
I'm like, are they not using DLSS on the 3090 Ti because it didn't have DLSS 3? And it sounds like it. In which case, to answer Sarah's question, that's not at all trustworthy in my book. Like that does not seem
trustworthy.
That's taking a feature and going, oh well, we added this thing that can't run on the old cards, but DLSS 2 totally could have run and would have gotten us at least half of the difference probably.
But since it wasn't applicable, we'll just run nothing.
but I do know, I don't think Division 2, Valhalla, or Resident Evil Village have DLSS, which is why, shockingly, the 4080 12 gigabyte doesn't do better than the 3090 Ti in those. And DLSS to non-DLSS comparisons, also make for weird things because you're like, well, wait, are you upscaling 1080p to 4K compared to 4K native? Hopefully they're still doing DLSS 2 on, Cyberpunk, but it's not clear. And they didn't have like the big disclaimer slide at the end listing exactly how everything was tested and when it was tested and what driver versions and all that stuff. I mean, this is the difference between like a show like the GTC keynote and an actual like more in-depth, what would you call it? Like when Intel and AMD and Nvidia normally do GPU stuff and they give you slides showing performance, they have disclaimer slides showing exactly what they tested and how they tested, and then you can poke holes in it. And here, like
this is sort of that's the disclaimer on the bottom.
Yeah, and the disclaimer doesn't tell us everything that we need to know. Oh, all DLSS frame generation data and Cyberpunk 2077 with new ray tracing overdrive mode. Okay, that still doesn't tell us whether they had DLSS 2 on. I assume they did, but we also have multiplier performance with AI. And this is, so you can see Warhammer does have DLSS 3. Flight Simulator has DLSS 3. Those other games that they just showed did not have DLSS 3.
And these are all on 4090s, just for the people watching at home.
I assume, yeah.
No, that's what it says?
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a little blurry on this version, but I mean, Portal with RTX. Hey, it runs 570% faster with DLSS 3. So that's impressive, but it also says, well, what the heck are they doing? And does it actually look as good as not DLSS? And we will have to wait and see.
Opens like an actual portal in your room. How good it is.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the other issue of like talking about performance for games that aren't out yet. Like, I mean, it's like no one knows how it runs on anything else. So, to me, that's like when a brand new store opens and it says, "Oh, everything's 30% off." You haven't been open yet. How can it be 30% off? Like,
I mean, they definitely seem to be like trying to make up for the fact that crypto has crashed and nobody wants all of their GPUs. So.
They're also in this weird place, as we've said, right, where they're like, on the one hand, they're like, buy these new cards. On the other hand, they're like,
please buy these old cards. Remember, they still exist.
And we know they're going to overlap. Like every generation overlaps some, but when the 30 series started coming out, it felt to me like they were trying to clear out inventory of the 20 series pretty fast. But because of cryptocurrency and the pandemic, they actually didn't have a massive, backlog to clear out, and so they didn't have to worry about it as much. The 20 series, when that launched, I felt like the backlog of 10 series cards was, at least it was worse than when the 30 series launched. Like there was definitely some delays where you're like, oh, they're pushing things, they're raising prices. The 2080 Ti was much more expensive than the outgoing 1080 Ti. Anyway, so this is our savior, maybe.
So these are your guesses, yes?
So the Nvidia stuff is pretty much. So this has my old Nvidia data. So the core counts are correct, but the clock speed is wrong, which of course affects the teraflops would be 83 instead of 66. And AMD's, these are guesses, but reasonably educated guesses. We're basically looking at potentially doubling performance from both AMD and Nvidia. Who gets the better doubling? I mean, you also run into CPU performance limitations when you double at the high end. So, you'll need a very fast CPU to make the most of the 4090 or the 7900 XT, I suspect. But it's interesting that if you look at our benchmarks, the 3090 Ti and the 6950 XT, they're pretty close in traditional rendering performance. The 3090 Ti is faster at 4K by like 8%, but it's slower by like 4 or 5% at 1440p and 1080p. And if you look at their compute numbers, you're like, wait, NVIDIA's got 40 compared to just 24. What happens when we're looking at 60 compared to 80, roughly, or 60 compared to 85, or whatever that those numbers happen to be? Like, NVIDIA almost had twice the compute before, and now they're only going to have maybe 20 to 50% more compute on paper. How does that play out? I don't know. More importantly is going to be price, of course. I mean, if we know the 4090 is launching at $1,600. If the 7900 XT can deliver competitive performance and cost $1,000, then that's going to be good news for those who are willing to switch to AMD. If you're not willing to switch to AMD, you probably, it's not going to matter either way. You're going to have to suck it up and pay the Jensen tax or whatever you want to call it. And there's always Intel's Arc if you just really want to go out on a limb. Pat Gelsinger tweeted about Arc A770 coming, so it's getting a retail launch soon.
How many years have they been saying soon?
Well, yeah. It feels like it's a way of them saying, hey, we're not actually canning this product, but they haven't actually specifically said that because they could still do a China-only launch. I don't know.
I feel like for like 6 months, for about the past 6 months, when it's felt like these cards were actually coming soon, like I kept saying it's the worst possible time, and then the time somehow also keeps getting worse to launch new cards.
They'll probably come out before Grand Theft Auto 6. We'll go on record with that. So,
I mean, at least a few of them.
We got lots of jokesters. Slim Jim, Fallout 5. Don't you know Fallout 76 is Fallout 5? You're just supposed to play it forever. All right. I think that's the major announcements. Now you guys talk while I go and look and see if there's questions we need to address here.
I mean, one of the things that I was going to say about AMD is that, they're in a better place now, and they also have to make money. I think they're kind of done being the, like, hey, let's offer a lot of value company for a while. So, I mean, plus, if history holds, like, they're not going to be able to produce at anywhere near the volume that Nvidia is. So, like, there's, from a purely economic standpoint, like, there's no real reason for them to be super competitive, right? Like, if they can get close, they're gonna price their cards similar, maybe a little lower than Nvidia, right? But like, if they undercut them by a lot, they're just gonna not be able to keep stock.
They won't make as much money.
Why would they do that? Like,
I mean, that follows patterns that we've seen elsewhere with AMD, just in their CPU business, and even like in the laptop business. When you see the all AMD Advantage stuff, is that they want to be seen as a premium company. They don't want to be seen as a second fiddle, cheaper thing anymore. And so, that would make sense. I wouldn't pin all of my financial hopes on AMD, but I could be wrong.
Or my gaming hopes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I have confidence that they'll have something that's quite competitive, but I don't think they're going to make any drastic price undercuts. They're not in that place anymore.
So don't wait for AMD. Buy a GPU now, maybe later, possibly much later.
To quote NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, the more you buy, the more you save.
So, in talking about pricing, like, it's important to look at what we've heard of AMD's Navi 31. The die size for the graphics chiplet is half the size of 8102. Like, that's a big deal. 308 millimeters instead of 629 millimeters squared. Basically means they get over twice as many chips per 5 nanometer wafer. And despite the 4 nanometer Nvidia name, like, it's still basically 5 nanometer. Just like TSMC's N6 is basically, it's rules compatible, design language compatible with their N7. It's just like a tweak of it as far as we understand. So you're like half of a Navi 21, less than half of a Navi 21 chip, plus half of Nvidia's 4090 chip. And how much will that cost them? I mean, it's going to cost way less to manufacture those. But AMD, for better or worse, is used to playing second fiddle. So, we'll have to see how they actually end up competing. AMD, we're hearing about improvements in ray tracing performance there as well. Like, Nvidia is basically saying they doubled ray tracing performance again on an architectural level, and then they're adding more ray tracing cores on top of that. So, does this mean games will actually start using so much ray tracing that it really starts to make a difference? And, I had some people earlier saying, yes, I noticed a difference in ray tracing in other games. Like, where was that? I'll come back here. Anyway.
I mean, I'm excited to play Portal ray trace like that, but to me, like, that's the exciting thing. Like, Quake was fun ray trace. Like, I mean, I know part of it is just I'm like 45, but also, like, I feel like it still kind of feels like the most visually striking and interesting things being done with ray tracing are when, like, it's back built into an older game. Like,
yeah, Minecraft.
Yeah.
I mean, someone was saying Spider-Man, they thought it looked good on high. I definitely noticed it in Spider-Man, and that's partly, though, because I thought their screen space reflections were pretty bad. Like, there's some wonkiness. I don't know if that got fixed ever, but you could definitely tell when ray tracing was turned on in Spider-Man, and it was just doing reflections.
Yeah,
so
that was funny. That one I played Spider-Man on, like, PS4 when it launched. And then the bigger change for anyone who played it on PS4 to PC or PS5 was that you could play it at 60 frames per second, which is excellent. I don't know. I think Spider-Man, it adds, like, actually being able to see Spider-Man reflected in the window. Like, that's kind of neat, but I disagree that it changed it to, like, a game-changing level.
Yeah.
There are very
it's
few.
Visually cool, but it's not like, whoa, my game, if only I had seen this the first time. I mean, like, when you're playing the game, you probably wouldn't really even notice most of it. But yeah, when you're looking at the games and, like, like from a review standpoint, however, there's some cool stuff.
Yeah,
but
I mean, that's what gets back to what I was saying before about, like, there's a difference between what you notice when you're looking for things and what you notice when you're actually trying to enjoy the game, right? Like, that's why, like, for years when I was reviewing GPUs, like companies would push, like, whatever it was, if it was F1 or some other, like, racing game, and, like, look how cool the crowd looks. And I'm like, who's looking at the crowd when you're playing a race? Like, that is literally,
you're looking
like,
at the black texture of the road is what you're looking
Yes.
at.
But also games like Minecraft, where people are building stuff, and they're, like, they want to, like, it's kind of part game and part art, or part, like an exhibit. Then
so
I
highlighted Sacco Belmonte says asynchronous space warp, ASW.
Yep.
I think it was also called asynchronous time warp, depending on implementation. But that was the AR VR technology where you created an interpolated frame, and basically that sounds like what they're trying to do with this DLSS 3 stuff is create an extra frame to improve your performance. So thanks for reminding me of what it was called. I knew it was something synchronous, asynchronous, but I couldn't come up with the name out the top of my head. Yeah, that's about it for the initial RTX 40 salvo. We get to wait until November 3rd to see AMD's return fire. And, if you're not in a rush to upgrade, Sarah, you can wait and find out how they look.
I can wait forever.
You can wait forever.
It's not like...
What game do you play that's too slow? That's the real question.
Honestly, like, yeah, it's fine. You know what? That's not the point, okay?
But it is.
I'm not here at Tom's Hardware to worry about what I need. It's about what I want.
Fair enough.
But also, yeah, like I was very salty because I wanted to like upgrade, and I wanted to upgrade right during the crypto boom, and I was like, what are these GPUs costing like $1 billion? So then I was like, oh my gosh. So now even though like my GPU, it's not that old, I still feel like I missed, like, crypto miners, took something from me. So
Yeah,
They
I
did.
mean, I feel like that's part of the issue, right? Like, is if you feel like you're kind of on the cusp or you want to wait longer, right? Like, I think a lot of people are going to buy used cards. You can get, like, if they keep going down, and if you make a $200 get, like, if you have something that's not fast enough now, right, and you maybe make a $200 gamble on something that hopefully will last a couple of years and perform well enough. Like, I mean, I feel like there's a large part of.
you're saying I should go on eBay and buy a
I'm not saying
mining
you
card?
should. I'm saying a lot of people will. That's what I'm
I'm
saying.
already on eBay. Don't worry. I've been looking.
I think Rurutu speaks for a lot of people here. He says, he, she, it says, nope, I know my budget is around $500 and I don't really care what the ultra high end costs. It's like looking at cars that are way faster, and we're not looking in that price range, and that's totally fine. So I don't know what GPU Rurutu is actually running right now, but if he's running a 3060 or a 2060 or something like that, like maybe he gets into the 3080 range. But at the same time, if you're okay with what you have, and a 2060, despite being the slowest, well, I guess 3050 is slower, but 2060 is $230, something like that right now. It's still a totally fine gaming GPU. I mean, it's faster than most laptops have. Most laptops are still pushing like GTX 1650s. I'm like, you can play pretty much any game out there on a RTX 2060. You can't turn on all the bells and whistles. Like, it's not the end of the world to use that. Slim Jim says, for the performance boost, 4090 is justified with our high price, but it's too expensive for the average gamer. Absolutely.
It's definitely too expensive.
It's
whole
the
computer.
cost of a full-blown, high-end PC, or at least a upper mid-range PC, including a monitor.
I mean, I would also say that the justified for the performance boost, I would still wait and see, because
yes,
those
numbers are a little sketchy.
Those are by far best case scenario.
I can't imagine that there's, like, when I look at my performance benchmarks, there are a number of games where scaling at 1440p and 1080p on a 3090 Ti, 3090, 3080 Ti, and on down the stack, like, it really doesn't happen at 1080p for sure. 1440p is often limited unless you're playing a ray tracing game. And then at 4K, there's still games where you're like, it's starting to plateau. It hasn't flatlined, but it's getting there. And I'm like, doubling your graphics performance will definitely hit that plateau. Like, you'll probably see a 30% improvement in some games where they're just like, yeah, well, now you're running at 110 frames per second at 4K. That's as good as you're going to get. And you used to be getting 80, so congratulations. But yeah. Yeah, at least it's not a Titan RTX. Those were only $2,500, Rurutu. Cut them some slack. No. I mean, the interesting thing is, like, Titan cards had some extra features that GeForce cards didn't have. They had drivers that accelerated certain professional workloads. So despite, like, I think that's why we're not getting new Titans, is because NVIDIA's like, oh, well, we created those Titans, and then suddenly people started buying a $2,500 Titan instead of buying a $5,000 Quadro, which they're no longer called Quadro, but the RTX A6000, A8000, whatever their model numbers are. So I wish I could double my single-threaded CPU performance. Paul does too. All right. All right, well, thanks for joining us. We'll have the full review in, what is that, 3 weeks? Something like that? Yeah, that's almost exactly 3 weeks, right?
Of the
the
real
12th.
numbers.
You still have a few days to catch up on sleep, Jared.
So here's, and the launch date is October 12th, which I'm not under embargo yet, Nvidia, so you haven't told us these things. Speaking historically, Nvidia always has reviews go up the day before the launch embargo. So most likely check back on October 11th for the full review, and we'll see how they stack up. And then, AMD won't have its answer probably until, hopefully it's before Black Friday, because launching at Black Friday would be really painful and bad. And I mean, if you want to sell all your GPUs, make sure they're on shelves before the holiday shopping spree kicks off.
Also, that's also historically accurate because the 11th is a day after a holiday, and that's when Nvidia likes to launch GPUs.
and that sucks. And Matt laughs because he knows this.
Because I know.
It's the worst possible thing, because it's like, guess what? Jared's going to be working that holiday weekend to finish the damn review. Thanks, Nvidia. Like, look at the calendar next time. Notice that there's a holiday and say, let's launch the weekend before or after. All right?
They're like, we'll give you some more time.
Yeah.
To
You've
play
got
with
an
our
extra day to
GPU.
finish your review.
How
it just happens
lucky
to be a
for you.
holiday.
Yeah.
But I am excited to
and
test
let's not
them.
talk about when you get the drivers. That's a whole other issue.
Oh. EVGA
You'll have
talked
the
about that
hardware.
already.
Yes, you'll have the hardware, in your hands and not being able to do anything with it for several days.
You get the drivers like 2 minutes before NDA lifts. You're like,
Right.
here's the
You'll
driver.
get them before
Yeah.
EVGA does.
Yes, EVGA doesn't get drivers anymore. Too bad for them. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back I don't know if I'll be back on Thursday, because this was the big news for the week, but we'll be back next week for sure. And until then, like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.